So thank you for coming and thank you for having me. One of the things for you to prepare for this afternoon is that I will be requiring you to do some work, and so you need to think of a partner or two that you would like to work with this afternoon. So no more, as I say to students, no more than 3, because groups larger than 3 people, somebody gets left out. So 2 or 3 people per work group, please. So, to give you a bit of an outline of what I'm planning on doing this afternoon, first of all, I'm going to try and speak as little as possible to begin with. I do have a little bit of presentation to give, which includes the purpose of this tool that I've designed, the intended outcomes associated with it, and objectives. I'm going to try and define some terms and definitions, including a sort of mini crash course in stand dynamics, so that perhaps while we're working through the tool, we get bogged down as little as possible in differences of interpretation of terminology. My grandmother always told me that my problem is my first language should have been Welsh, not English. But English sucks, and forestry English is horrid because we use all kinds of terms to mean all kinds of different things. Very confusing for students, as I can probably speak to. So I'll try to be consistent. And then what I'm hoping to fill the majority of the afternoon is an actual working session where I'm going to give you some example stands, some actual data to work with the key, through the key, and get some feedback on whether it actually works as intended. And please don't hesitate to stop me with questions or comments at any point. So, goals. The C&C, as I'm calling, the climate and carbon silvicultural keys that I've designed have been designed to produce 2 goals at the forest stand level. One is to maintain or enhance the climate change resilience of a forest stand. The other is to maximize the carbon storage of an actively managed forest stand. So the key point here is that I was tasked with both goals associated with this tool. The climate change adaptation resilience definitely plays a higher order of priority in the way the tool is designed to work. But both of those goals are attempted to be equally addressed with this tool. Go ahead.
Can the carbon storage be in the soil?
Sure could. Certainly could. It's not a parameter that's necessarily explicitly addressed by the tool. You'll see that a large body of the outcomes would seek to address that as well. But the tool is silvicultural in a classical sense, in the sense that the approach to the tool is either attempting to deliberately manipulate the structure and composition structure of the canopy, of the forest, of the trees, rather, sorry, not forest, the trees, and possibly site level, sort of classical site preparation techniques. But I don't know if I answered your question. Good. So first, I have an exercise. I told you I was trying not to speak too much. The more I talk, the more uncomfortable I get. So, part 1, I want you, as an individual, to write down your definitions to silviculture, stand, silvicultural treatment, and silvicultural system. In a minute, couple minutes, what are your definitions for those terms? Silviculture, stand, silvicultural treatment, and silvicultural system. The second part of this exercise, I'd like you to find a partner or 2, no more than 1 or 2, and discuss your answers to those definitions. So, any questions or comments you want to share with the group with regards to those definitions? People, when they discuss them with each other, are fairly consistent in their ideas of what those things mean? No Welsh involved? No? Okay. My grandmother would be disappointed. So, this is the working definition of silviculture that I use in my classroom and working with students. I'm used to looking up at the board. I can look here. So, The science and technology of establishing and maintaining forest stands that have value to people. So silviculture is forest management at the stand level. And effective silviculture relies on knowledge, both science and indigenous knowledge. And what I mean by indigenous knowledge here is in the broader classical sense, knowledge of the land. Right? I mean, a lot of the most successful silviculture that has ever existed has existed in the absence of modern science, right, over millennia. And what I mean by indigenous is not necessarily property of indigenous or Aboriginal people, in the sense that anybody that works long enough and pays attention long enough in a given locality can develop indigenous knowledge. And then, of course, silviculture is not a science, it's an applied science, so there's a fair amount of messy, muddy trial and error associated with it, most definitely. The stand, another definition, being a distinct patch of forest as the traditional or classical basic management unit of silviculture, and it is purely a concept. You know, students, certain types of students want me to specifically and absolutely define the boundaries of stands, but the reality is that we decide where the boundaries of stands lie based on not only the actual ecological context, but the managed objectives we're managing for, right? David Smith was famous for saying that there actually is no such thing as an uneven age stand, because every little mini cohort in an uneven age stand is a little mini stand doing its mini thing, right? So where we draw the lines around stands are really, it is a human construct, but we do draw lines around them in order to effectively manage them. Patches of forest get so big at a certain scale that operationally we can't manage them. Obviously, we need to manage them strategically at the landscape level, but silviculture is about managing at the operational level, the level we walk around and can smell and taste and identify everything around.
Would you not say, though, that there is some sort of homogeneity at the ecological context level?
There can be.
Because if you don't have that, you could, I guess, potentially you could still call it a stand.
Sure you could, but I guess anybody who's taken a course in sort of photo interpret and photogrammetry will recognize that there's two different people in the room, splitters and lumpers. And the reality is that it's amazing the hairs that people split. And I'm a lumper, not a splitter. Like, I tend to identify things that are obviously distinctly different, and if it's not different, I don't try to make it different. I mean, and that doesn't mean to suggest that there isn't diversity within that patch, but we do draw lines around things, right? And the more sophisticated our ability to classify site becomes, the more lines we can draw even between patches that seem homogeneous, right? And there are parts of the Maritimes, for example, where the pear material is poor and there's like contiguous tracts of black spruce dominated forest, ranging from bogs to swamps to moist sites to dry sand esters, right? Is that all the same stand? Completely different ecosites dominated by black spruce. Anybody else? Cool. Definition of silvicultural treatment or intervention is some of the other language that people use. A specific action, meaning something done to a stand intended to manipulate the stand composition, structure, and dynamics of the stand. Classically, this means one of two things: either to manipulate the composition and structure of the vegetation, for example, cutting things, killing trees, killing plants, or to manipulate the actual site characters through some form of mechanical site preparation, for example. That's just two examples of sort of two groupings of treatments. So treatment is a specific action, as opposed to a silvicultural system, which is a complete plan for the maintenance of stand composition and structure in the long term into the next generation of trees and perhaps even beyond. Classically, in the Germanic tradition, and anybody in English-speaking language who studied forestry, including Scandinavia and Finland, have inherited a Germanic perspective on silviculture. Most of the premier forestry schools in the Western and Nordic world were founded by either German foresters or foresters that were trained in Germany. So classically, silvicultural systems are classified by the age structure they seek to maintain. So even age systems, 2H systems, uneven age systems, and then what I like to call hippie silviculture, regular systems. And it's a good fit for me. So, climate and carbon storage keys, the objectives that I worked with were, one, climate change resilience and adaptation objective, meaning to maintain or encourage tree species that are low risk. So again, this is a silvicultural tool. So there's a basic assumption for the most part of this tool that the stand is going to be actively managed and actively manipulated with some outcome. So one of the basic premises of this tool is that it seeks to manipulate stands towards lower risk in terms of climate change. So species being defined as high risk as those that are expected to undergo either a high degree of stress associated with climate change and or to be, as Anthony described so well, to become under some situation in ecological context where they're no longer competitive with a site. What's that? Maladaptive was the word used. Thank you. Maladaptive, right? So the keys are designed to encourage the practitioner to manipulate stands towards lower risk, so it's the climate change. So that basically the treatment outcomes are either to tend cohorts or trees and stands towards lower risk, or to favor the regeneration of lower risk species. And depending on the age structure that's being maintained, perhaps both simultaneously. Cool. Low risk tree species. The working definition I have is tree species that are predicted to be resilient and or adaptable to climate change. I went down a million different rabbit holes to design this current draft of this tool. It's probably one of the most difficult things I've ever worked on, many of which were an attempt to go through some sort of, I've been trained as a technologist to identify and classify and measure and assess and evaluate. That's how my brain is almost hardwired, and I train people to do the same. So my initial attempts were to try to come up with almost like a forest inventory tool for these outcomes. What I recognize is that A, I'm not an expert in climate change. B, what is a low-risk species is a moving target. So for example, if you work in the western ecoregion in Nova Scotia, I'm sure balsam fir is a high-risk species in terms of climate change. But if you work at 500 meters, 300 to 500 meters elevation in northwestern New Brunswick, is balsam fir a high-risk species right now? Certainly over the next 50 years or 100 years, right? So the reality is that what you rate as the hazard rating associated with climate change must depend on the ecological context in which you work. It requires a very robust and sophisticated ecological land classification system. Nova Scotia's, I must admit, is much further along than New Brunswick's is. New Brunswick's was excellent. We need to work on it. And then it's also a moving target, as Anthony so clearly projected this morning, right? So what's true now is not true necessarily in 50 years, is not true in 100 years. And what's true in Southern Ontario is not necessarily true in Southern New Brunswick. So,
Gareth, does your key also lump in, say, forest pest species that may be affected by climate change as well?
No.
Okay.
No. And I've got a question that you're gonna have to try and answer related to that when you work through the key. Thank you.
So, exercise 2. First part, please write down 3 tree species that you would consider high risk in terms of climate change based on your own gut feeling or expertise or this morning's presentation. So what you think are 3 high-risk tree species and what you would consider as 3 low-risk tree species. Anybody want to share some high-risk species that you identified? Please? You think sugar maple is a high-risk species? Anybody disagree with Julian?
Where are we living? Where are we working?
Ah, moving target. So you think sugar maple's high risk? Anybody disagree? Okay. Jillian, why'd you pick sugar maple's high risk?
Describe to them just because it's, specific to its environment and certain conditions, I believe, too.
Interesting.
Interesting point.
Can you repeat what she said? It's hard to hear.
Well, what Jillian's speaking to is the fact that the interesting thing for a species like sugar maple in our climate is there actually is, again, I'm not talking about high elevation boreal sites in Maritimes, but there is no climatic limitation to the range of sugar maple in the Maritimes right now. So where we don't find it is site restrictions. So it grows on our best sites. So what you're suggesting is that as such it's sensitive to change?
Yeah, and I'm thinking about hardwoods and, like, for example, last year, like, we had a frost late into the year and it killed the buds. I'm thinking like hardwoods are going to be sensitive to that because they have different growth stages throughout the year. Their buds and their leaves.
Cool.
Well, what Jillian's speaking about is, when you mentioned specific example, is that there was late frost that did a lot of damage to sugar maple early growth? Okay. So severe weather events and being sensitive to. Yep.
That combined with moisture availability. So last year that happened was with us, which we did a commercial thinning on a sugar maple stand, and it was decimated by an insect pest, but it was precluded by a long drought period, which we didn't accommodate for. When we were cutting trees, we saw there was barely any sap coming out of the trees. At the time of the year, characteristically, in that same site, we saw moisture coming out of them like crazy. So that severe long drought period weakened their defenses. It was basically like it had such a limited range in site characteristics that the moisture unavailability made them more susceptible.
Right.
Anybody been on in the walk in the Maritimes with Ralph Nyland? Like if you go for a walk in the woods with a northern hardwood silviculturalist from like the heartland of like the best sugar maple sites in the world, they can't even figure out how sugar maple grows on sites in southern New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Like for sugar maple forest to grow in a coarse textured soil, they're like did I get transported to a different dimension? Like if they were to pick up that site and move it to the northern Great Lakes states, it'd be growing pine and oak. But remember that, with Nova Scotia and southern New Brunswick built-in air conditioning and that ecozone with that constant humidity, right? Sugar maple grows on sites that it wouldn't do western. So what you're suggesting is that there's some risk associated with that at the site level.
And there is risk associated with sugar maple as far as pollution as well, because
Right.
it's very susceptible to acidic soils.
Right. Right.
It's just interesting that sugar maple came up because when we were talking, both Rob and Nelson brought up sugar maple.
Yeah.
And for me, for the work that we've done showing this morning, it's probably been one of the most difficult species to get a handle on.
Right.
And the modeling that we've done that it didn't do well, but the reason it didn't do well was competing with the beach all the time,
Right.
which is probably quite similar to the beach.
Have you talked to Ralph Nyland?
Oh, I haven't made that. But I would say right now, in terms of not just my work, but others, that I think it's one of the most uncertain ones right now. Like fir seems to be a no-brainer, also fir. Other ones like red maple seem to be, yeah, this one's gonna, for sugar maple, you get all sorts of mixed thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, well, even in the Maritimes, right? If you work in western or northwestern Brunswick, the best sugar maple stands are on fine textured soils, particularly in the valley lowlands, right? Sites that are actually moist in Nova Scotia, growing spruce and fir, because the moisture regime is higher in the summer and the evapotransportation rate, right? So it really does depend on where you are. Kim?
The only other thing I want to mention is that risk, the concept of risk, is also relative not just to climate change, but to your management goals.
Sure.
Because if your management goal is to increase coarse woody debris,
Sure.
it turns that concept on its head. High risk, and you want dead trees.
Sure. Sure. Yep. Any other high-risk species, sugar maple?
Jack pine?
Jack pine? Anybody disagree? Let Jack know. Any others?
We'll go white birch.
White birch. Anybody disagree with white birch? Kim disagrees or agrees with white birch?
I disagree.
Disagree. What about low-risk species? What do people have for low-risk species?
Basswood.
Basswood. Red oak. That's a really good one. It makes you feel good. Feel really good. Yeah, until you go to research forests in West Virginia, Virginia State, and they tell you they've been trying to get rid of red maple for 60 years to grow red oak, just to find people like red maple better. Yeah. Any other low-risk species?
Silver maple.
Silver maple. Interesting.
I have black cherry dying on my property.
Okay.
Look,
What's it dying out, do you think?
no, it gets up to about 15, 20 feet high.
Well, I've got the black cherry. I'm at the northern limit of black cherry on my property on the southern slopes in the central uplands. But if you go even 10 miles down the road, there's no
Where's your
black cherry.
property?
Stanley. But I'm on southern exposures in the Upper Nashwauk. But if you go to southern New England or the Allegheny Plateau, like black cherry is like
I'm in woodland.
unbelievable. Who's in Maine?
No, woodland up Stanwood.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
Just south of Stanley.
Yeah, well, my black cherry looks like that too. But I think there's probably there's climate related there. I think we're right at the northern black cherry. Any other low risk species?
Ironwood.
Ironwood. Cool.
White pine.
White pine. There's white pine at high elevation in Mexico. Which is pretty cool. Like actual strobus.
It's also
I've seen it. What's that?
It's also in border too.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yeah. Exactly. Massive ridge. Massive ridge. Okay. Thank you.
As I pointed out at the beginning, what I was tasked with was also to include carbon storage.
You're welcome.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah. And getting back to Tom's question, the primary focus I took with that is from a classical silviculture perspective of actual wood storage as opposed to soil storage. So based on the notion that carbon storage from a silvicultural perspective essentially amounts to maintaining a high density stand over the longest period of time possible. So the more density you store or a given period of time, the more carbon you're storing. So for example, people that are actually monetizing carbon projects at this point, my understanding is they're looking at 100-year time horizons. Right? Tom?
Such as it complicates this further. This is like on the stump in the woods.
Yep.
So product mix, which also would have carbon implications.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Well, if you boil down the soil carbon, I mean, you
Right.
come to the same thing. You want a high density stand
Yes.
that isn't disturbed. So,
Right.
it's, you know.
Right. Yep. In an ideal classical sense, which would really turn the likes of Ralph Nyland on and a bunch of Germanic obsessives, you know, the ideal, the normal belt, the perfect forest, in a perfect theoretical context, the perfectly balanced uneven age stand that carried a high basal area would be a perfect carbon storage stand. Basically, permanent canopy cover, a balance of all ages, even equal growing space for all cohorts in the stand, in perfection, the planter forest, right? In reality, that's easier said than done, which I think anybody who's tried to even approach that would be able to recognize. And certainly the tool that I've designed definitely recognizes. So within the context of recognizing that there aren't very many stands on the landscape that would allow one to have a perfectly balanced uneven stand, at the very least, the key seeks to manage stands towards high densities for long rotations, right? Which is one of the reasons why none of the outcomes from the keys I've designed suggest short rotation, even age silviculture. There's a number of other reasons as well, but the primary one being that the carbon storage objective cancels out that option.
because there's a lot of talk, realistic and reasonable talk, about if you're managing forests intensively for fiber production, that short rotation forestry is highly desirable because you can quickly adapt to changes in climate. But if we're talking about the combination of climate change and adaptation resilience and carbon storage, growing stands, even age stands for 25, 35 years, 40 years, even 60 years, doesn't store a lot of carbon. And then and I get into this with students all the time. I mean, when we're talking about high density stands, it also depends on how we measure density. And anybody who's worked in practice, the most effective way to measure density operationally is by using basal area as an index of it. So either meters square per hectare or feet square per hectare. So, before I give you some stuff to work on, I'm going to give you a little quick crash course in some of the terminology that's used in the keys. The first number of which relates to disturbance dynamics, the stand dynamics. So major disturbances being events that stimulate stands that are dominated by a single age group of trees, regardless of the biological age of trees. So for example, the keys speak of cohorts, not age classes, but for a very intentional reason. Although age class is the traditional Germanic term that we use, it can be a very confusing term in the sense that natural stands or cohorts in stands originate from single events, regardless of the age of the trees. So for example, in this picture, we have a regeneration layer in a stand that is established over decades in the top picture. I don't have the clicky pointing thing. But in the top picture, we have a regeneration layer that is developed in the shade of that stand, which in our climate, historical climate, is typical of stands as they age. Moisture is not traditionally, historically, a limiting factor to forest growth and tree growth in our climate. Shade-tolerant species appear in the regeneration layer if you wait long enough without having to do anything to our stands. And then there's been a major disturbance event in the second picture, which has allowed enough sunlight into the understory to initiate a new stand, right? But the biological age of those trees in that new stand could be all of them out, right? I mean, we have record red spruce that sit for 150 years waiting for light. And then they grow along with 5-year-old red spruce, and 50 years later, you would not be able to recognize necessarily the difference between either of those trees. Major disturbance versus minor disturbance. Disturbances that initiate cohorts in a stand but do not initiate a new stand. And as David Smith would say, there is no such thing as a uneven age stand, because even that little mini hole kind of acts like a little mini stand in and of itself. Disturbance patterns, right? So in this example is an example of high severity disturbance, where the majority of the overstory and the understory is destroyed by a disturbance. In our climate, the only natural event that mimics this is fire. And because moisture is not a limiting factor in our historical climate, fires historically in our part of the world were high severity, meaning that they were infrequent, but the buildup of fuel and fire ladders, when they did occur, meant that the overstory and the understory were burned. Right? So this example, we have spruce fir pine forest. A fire occurs in the second picture. Fire-resistant white pine survive the fire, and then they seed down and burn. So that's an example of a high severity disturbance, being a major one, stand replace event, as opposed to this example, where we have another major disturbance event, but it is not high severity, which historically would have been more frequent in our landscape. Right? Not every 60 years, perhaps, but certainly more frequent than fires, in the sense that at some point, perhaps an event would occur that would destroy some or all of the canopy, releasing regeneration that was already established in the understory. Right? So again, that's another example of a major disturbance event, but in this case, it's moderate severity, not high severity. Questions or comments?
I have a question. So I recently read a data that
400 years ago or so, there could have been up to 8% of the land mass which was covered by wetlands, like beaver created wetlands. So, when you look at the role of water in terms of retaining carbon as well, does that factor into how you look at this silvicultural model at all? Because essentially the beaver can act as a little silviculturalist.
Absolutely.
Doing very micro site disturbance around their wetlands. So that would have impacts, obviously, but I realize it's not necessarily exactly what you're looking at, but I'm just wondering how it interrelates with what you're looking at.
It's not something I thought about when I was developing it, to be quite honest with you, that specific example. I do know, talking to foresters working in Burlington in Northern Ontario, their 40-year plus buffer operational strategy in the boreal forest in Ontario is such that they see a decline in beaver habitat as a result. So on specific sites, they're actually getting alterations to permits to actually actively stimulate early successional hardwoods in stream and watercourse buffers in boreal Ontario to try to encourage beaver habitat, for example. Right? So I mean, if you manage all buffers to be spruce and fir, there's beaver habitat. So. But I certainly didn't think of beaver specifically with that example, or as it relates to flooding of swamps. Of course, and then with a beaver pond, when it's abandoned, you end up in a meadow, as opposed to a forest division. Anybody else? As an alternate example, low severity minor disturbances, which occur within stands that don't replace entire stands. In this example, there's a sequence of events. Because they didn't draw any dead trees, it's clearly caused by either beavers or people, probably people. The dead bodies have been taken away. So for example, in that picture of 3 sequences, there's been some partial cutting or harvesting of some kind, stimulating new cohorts in the stand, producing a multi-age stand of some kind. So, with that in mind, and I don't know these come up in orders. It was a weird week. The key speaks to single cohort dominated stands. So these are stands that have a canopy that is dominated by one age group. It does not mean all the trees are biologically the same age. It means they originated from a single event. Right? In this example, we have a sequence where regeneration develops in a partial overstory in the second picture, and then some sort of major event occurs. Let's assume a harvest and overstory removal, and we end up with a new regenerating stand following this event. But those trees in that final picture are not all the same age. They're the same cohort, but biologically, because they developed in the understory of the previous stand, they're not the same age, right? So if you were to use some sort of narrow definition of age class structure and say anything that's not within 10 years of itself is in a different cohort, nature doesn't work that way. These trees don't care what the age of their neighbors are, right? So that single cohort stand comes from that single event, regardless of the age of the trees. It also speaks to double cohort stands, which are the product, again, of major disturbance events, where canopy trees survive the disturbance, and you end up with a double cohort, a 2-age stand. Right? So again, even age stands and 2-age stands are both dominated by a single cohort. The difference in 2-age or double cohort stands is that canopy trees actually survive the event of producing 2-age stands. Questions or comments? As opposed to multi-cohort or uneven age stands that are the product of continuous minor events. Truly uneven age stands, right, and balanced uneven age stands don't exist in nature. They're the construct of human beings. But uneven age stands do exist, right? And what they're a product of is continuous disturbance events, which cause gaps in the stand, which recruit new cohorts, and you end up with an intimate mix of multiple cohorts in the stand over time.
And the key does or doesn't apply to that?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Okay. Uneven age stands. So the other thing that the keys speak to are Oliver and Larson's development stages in the classic Stand Dynamics book, which the part of the reason for me putting this up there is that people in different jurisdictions may use different terminology to describe these development stages and stands. The first development stage being stand initiation. I don't know if we can read that on the chart, but on the far left of that diagram, a stand initiation stage is an initiating development stage following a major disturbance event, where there is now light and available growing space for generation release. Stem exclusion being the second stage in that sequence occurs and begins when the trees actually form a closed canopy, right? And trees start organizing themselves into different crown classes, into different canopy layers. Generally during stem exclusion, there's no space in the canopy for new recruitment. So mortality in the stem exclusion stage is primarily driven by differences in shade tolerance, competitive advantage, whatever else, right? So in general, dominant trees grow faster, suppressed trees grow slower, and eventually die. If you have mixed stands, it can be very complex because, for example, in our part of the world, you might have white birch mixed with balsam fir and red maple, and the white birch might actually initially dominate because of its rapid growth and shade and tolerance, but then would eventually die back and be replaced by spruce and fir and hemlock or sugar maple and beech during the stem exclusion stage. Understory reinitiation being, as they say and when I worked in Washington State, they called it the transition stage. Some people refer to it as the transition stage because understory reinitiation is the transition between the dominance of a single age group towards a very old, multi-aged forest condition. What starts to occur as stem exclusion stands get aged is that canopy gaps, true canopy gaps, start to form in that stand, allowing recruitment or ingrowth of understory trees into the canopy. So over time, the stand becomes more and more multi-aged. Again, this development sequence assumes the absence of another major disturbance event. If we had a major disturbance event at any point along the sequence, we would go back to stand initiation. Right? So for example, if you had a balsam fir stand in the Cape Breton Highlands on an exposed site, the chances that it's ever going to make it to an old growth, multi-age, gap-driven development stage are very unlikely. But I've been in true gap-driven, multi-aged, old balsam fir forests on the North Peninsula in Newfoundland, where there are 300-year-old balsam fir trees and everything else in between, and enough deadwood to require like climbing gear to get through the understory. Okay. So balsam fir is certainly capable of growing. Balsam fir forest is capable of growing into that stage. The final stage in Oliver and Larson's development stage sequence is the term old growth as a development stage. I wish they hadn't used that term because the unfortunate part is the term old growth means a lot of things to a lot of different people. Welcome to the English language. Other language used for that development stage has been things like the gap-driven phase or the shifting mosaic, which is Mormon and lichens, or the steady state phase. Like there's all kinds of words for it. But eventually, a stand that originated from a single cohort, if left long enough, will develop this old, multi-aged jungle of sorts. Okay? Questions or comments? So when I'm talking about old growth stage, not that the key specifically speaks to it for that reason. But if I were to talk about the old growth stage, I'm talking about a development stage, not a specific definition of what the growth is. Succession in the key.
Is there a hierarchy in those development stages in reference to C&C? Like one of them produces more, is more resilient, or has more climate change or carbon storage capacity than another one?
No, certain types of stands on certain kinds of sites become more and more susceptible to major disturbance events as they get older. There's no question about it. Certain types of stands on certain kinds of sites are capable of going into those very old development stages. But it's very important to recognize that if a stand reaches that stage of development, it's not a product of intervention, it's a product of stand development. I'm not suggesting that a multi-age shifting gap old forest is the same thing as a managed uneven age stand. The two are very different. Quickly before we move on, successional patterns, right? So in these two diagrams, they're both examples of initial floristics. The one on the left being the tolerance model, the one on the right being the parallel model. So contrary to Clementsian succession, particularly in our part of the world, the reality is that high severity major disturbance events are actually naturally highly infrequent in our historical climate. It depends on the site you're on. But mid-successional and late successional species typically survive major disturbance events, either in the regeneration layer that developed underneath the old stand or in the presence of seed trees that survive the event. So in the sequence on the left, we have early successional hardwoods, which we all love to either love or love to hate, depending on what we're managing for, and some form of later successional species. In the example on the left, in order for those later successional species to survive, they must be shade, right? The tolerance or inhibition model. On the right, we have another successional pathway called the parallel model, which recognizes that a lot of mid-successional species, like white pine, like red oak, actually need to make it into a competitive crown position in the canopy because they're not shade tolerant. Otherwise, they'll get the crap kicked out of them, and we'll lose them, right? So it's important to recognize the species you're working with, and those patterns that exist. And close out. The keys speak to different types of silvicultural systems. So the keys are not only designed to arrive at a treatment, but also, first and foremost, a suggested silvicultural system towards managing a stand, right? With the aims of climate change resilience and carbon storage. So one being classical even-age systems, which are designed to create and maintain and reproduce even-age stands that are exclusively dominated by a single cohort, versus two-age stands that are also designed to reproduce stands dominated by a single cohort. But unlike even-age systems, two-age systems retain canopy trees into the next rotation, so that you have a dominant cohort with older trees. Versus uneven-age silviculture systems, which deliberately attempt to maintain an intimate mix of multiple cohorts, multiple age groups, through continuous minor disturbances, some form of partial cutting of some kind, the classical language selection systems, to produce and maintain truly uneven age stands through that continuous disturbance. And then finally, hippie silviculture. The reality is that whether we would like it or not, many of the desirable species we're trying to manage do not have continuous regeneration patterns, whether we want them to have them or not. That is just the truth, right? So one of the problems with this picture is that you need to get continuous desirable regeneration for it to work. And if you don't, it fails. And we failed at it over and over and over and over again. If you want to go for a drive and mixed wood, hodgepodge, rotten fir, red maple, I can take for a drive with Cater Research Forest, where they did single tree selection on every mixed wood site for 60 years and grew rotten fir and red maple from old stands of spruce, pine, fir, red maple mixed wood. So, what? Which one? The rotten fir, red maple hodgepodge? Yeah, probably. We got lots of examples of it. So the point I'm making is just because you're doing selection cutting doesn't mean you're actually effectively managing an uneven age stand. This requires continuous recruitment of desirable growing stock. The reality is that often when uneven age systems won't work, some form of hippie silviculture will, right? There's some German dude who tried to make this illegal in Germany in the 18th century. Oh, it was hard taken. The concept being that you wait until the combination of markets and regeneration conditions are ideal for regeneration. And then you gradually regenerate the stand as you see fit over extended periods of time. And then eventually you manage the next stand. So during the regeneration period, or to a logger, an irregular shelfwood might feel a lot like selection cutting, because it's partial cutting, this and that, messing around, gotta protect all this crap, too expensive, whatever else. But at the end of sequence 6, you actually have a new stand that you actually manage, and you ignore the fact that it is regular and it's got different age trees and whatever else. In an irregular system, there is no attempt to manage multiple cohorts in the stand. At the end of the regeneration period, however long it takes, which could be decades, you end up with this hippie stand that you just let grow and manage it into the next rotation. So unlike uneven age silviculture, it doesn't depend on this constant maintenance and constant management. It's actually a very different approach to this. Very different.